In this video, we are to look at solving quadratic equations. Probably we shall use factorization method. Previously we looked at how we factorize quadratic expressions, and we use the same idea in solving quadratic equations. But how do we come up with quadratic equations? We've seen quadratic expressions, and what is the difference between quadratic expression and a quadratic equation? We get a quadratic equation from quadratic expression. When a quadratic expression is equated to a figure, it becomes a quadratic equation. For instance, if I have x squared plus 2x plus 3 equaling to 0, that is a quadratic equation. And we solve quadratic equations by finding the value of the unknown. For any two numbers, let's say p and q, if pq equals to 0, then p equals to 0, and that means that also q times 0 gives us 0. Similarly, if we have two brackets equaling to 0, then it means that each bracket equals to 0. For instance, if we have 2x plus 1 times x minus 3 equaling to 0, then it means that 2x plus 1 equals to 0 and x minus 3 equals to 0. And therefore in that we shall solve for x. So what do I try to mean? It means that when solving quadratic equations, we shall first of all factorize this equation into two brackets. Then we equate these two brackets to 0. And then each bracket will be equated to 0 to find the unknown. For instance, we are supposed to solve x minus 4 into x plus 1. If x minus 4 into x plus 1 equals to 0, then it means that either the first bracket equals to 0 or the second bracket equals to 0. And when we equate these two brackets to 0, we shall find the values of x. If we equate the first bracket to 0, you get x as 4. When you equate the second bracket to 0, you get x as negative 1. Hence, those are the roots of the equation. The roots of the equation will be 4 and negative 1. In our second example, we are told to factorize x squared plus 7x plus 6 equals to 0. So we shall factorize this quadratic expression by changing this expression to two brackets. we've seen that. We saw how we factorize quadratic expression, whereby we get the sum and product and then the factors. So we shall factorize the quadratic expression to get two brackets. Then these two brackets are the ones we are going to equate to 0. We equate each bracket to 0 to find the values of x. And these values of x will be the one that satisfy the equation. And that can also be checked by substituting for x. So what is important here is you need to first know how we factorize quadratic expressions. After factorizing the quadratic expressions and you get your two brackets, we equate those two brackets to 0, and after we consider one by one to get the values of the unknown or the roots that satisfy the equation. And every quadratic equation that has power 2 has two solutions, meaning that as you are solving a quadratic equation, you must get two solutions. Let's look at the example 9.16, which says solve x squared plus x minus 72 equals to 0. In solving this, we shall look for the sum, product, and the factors, so that we factorize this quadratic expression to come up with two brackets, which each is equated to 0 to find the value of x. So in this, the sum is 1 because it is the coefficient of x, and then the product is negative 72. So we look for factors or for numbers that we add to get 1 and multiply to get negative 72. I gave you a clue on this, whereby we look at the factors of 72, and from the factors of 72 is where we shall get the required factors. 72, the suitable factors are 8 and 9, because from 8 and 9 is where we can get the sum of 1. That is, if we make 8 negative and 9 positive, we add them to get a 1, and still we shall multiply them to get negative 72. So after getting your factors, you come and substitute them so that you come up with pairs and find the common factors, factorize them out, and then have the two brackets. I would advise you, before you look at solving quadratic equations, you first look at the video of factorizing quadratic expressions, because it is the same knowledge that we shall employ in solving quadratic expressions. In fact, solving quadratic equations will be much easier for you if you have known or mastered factorizing quadratic expressions. But what you should know is your target of solving quadratic equations should be having two solutions or two values of the unknown. If we look at example 9.17, it's a bit different from others because we've seen where a quadratic expression is equal to 1 instead of 0 as it has been. So when you have such an equation, then you carry the one the other side so that we have 0, because a quadratic equation can be easily solved if it is equal to 0. So doing that, we must take the one the other side so that we get x squared minus x minus 30 equals to 0. Because when the one crosses the equal signs, it becomes a negative, and then it gives us negative 30. So when we have x squared minus x minus 30 equals to 0, we now think of getting the sum and the product, where the sum will be negative 1 and then the product will be negative 30. So we look at the factors. What two numbers can we add to get negative 1 but multiply to get negative 30? That is probably negative 6 and 5. So we substitute where we have negative x is where we shall put negative 6x plus 5x. Then we get 4 terms which are paired and find the common factor out to give us the two brackets we want. Those two brackets will be x minus 6 into x plus 5 equals to 0. And we equate each bracket to 0 to find the value of x. And those are the roots they are asking for. Yes. The example below will be yours to try out. Remember, practice makes improvement.